Yo, what's up everybody? So what is this? The ninth installment of our reading of Aristotle in this graphic biography. Well, for the most part, we are sort of coming to the end here. You can see we only have about that much left of the book to read. And I sort of went over some, I think, important details on the last installment of this series because I was mostly focused on him saying that, you know, basically everything mattered, you know, which is kind of contradictory to maybe the general focus of specific people and their interests. I think doing something like that sort of devalues your surroundings and in a lot of ways makes everything feel really depressed because truth and all things that seem real in your world as things that stand alone are basically susceptible to the frailties and the quickness of change that all things are susceptible to. It's like telling everybody, or you know, making everybody believe the end is near because we know the truth, sort of thing, is basically how I would almost reinterpret that today. Just basically trying to say something different that almost alludes to the exact same reaction. If we can just, you know, say that perhaps things that lead to maybe the same product of a feeling ultimately have some form of, if there's topology, which, you know, states that different structures are basically the same structure, then, you know, maybe like philology or something like that, you know what I mean? Sensology kind of thing. But we're thinking philosophically, and what I sort of failed to mention is that he is basically now breaking apart all of this philosophy into different sorts of studies. And he is breaking down the general idea of science, the sciences, and of all the sort of lineations between different fields of study. Now, ultimately, I think that what this really kind of comes to be, in a sense that we're going to use that sensology that I just briefly spoke on, I think that ultimately what you're doing when you try to separate out these fields of study and try to basically almost place the cause of yourself as close as you could be to, let's say, that idea that nothing moves, almost, you know, giving yourself, in other words, as much value as possible, because I think that almost with the idea of wealth, we can then understand how perhaps maybe wealth itself diversifies, and with that idea that we can sort of trace these lines of money, I think that in a lot of similar ways, sort of trying to become the most wealthy or the richest in a certain sense would then allow you to see the world around you, and perhaps things even beyond that nature itself begin to lineate themselves and begin to arrange themselves in classifications. And I think that ultimately the recognition begins with recognizing yourself in a philosophical stance rather than recognizing wealth. As soon as you recognize yourself in a philosophical sense, you can basically then see how everything differs from you. And that's sort of what we're seeing here, is Aristotle has sort of like tripped over all of these sticks and stones and bumped into people along the way, but has basically conquered the fear of saying nothing. And has allowed himself to discover who he honestly believes he really is. And I think that that allows these things to sort of lineate themselves in your world as well. And then he can sort of classify what he sees. And then sort of classify perhaps even orders of himself as well. And I think I want to try to express more how acquiring wealth, I think in a lot of ways, is a way to, again, sort of overcome that idea of fear and allow you to stay stationary. And I think that the more stationary that you sort of become, it then sort of forces this idea that you can see what is genuinely moving beyond you. And so the closer you get to the idea of becoming stationary, and I think that's how perhaps wealth can prove that idea. And then perhaps you see all the variations of wealth in its distribution, which allows you to see a multifaceted nature of the world and of reality, which is ultimately all this really is anyways. And so, kind of running with that same notion, I'm going to then take another step back in this kind of forked narrative here, this branch, and talk about ultimately though, what is the idea, the general vague idea that sort of surmises ultimately this narrative of lineating things within our lives. And I think that ultimately what you're doing is I'm trying to base this off of the most sure way that I can think of, sort of on the spot here, about this idea of something natural, perhaps, versus an idea. And I think if I was to just basically state the idea itself, it is that you are working to prove that emotion itself is something that doesn't characterize the truth. You are working to prove that things are without there being no work involved. So it requires things to work for things to be, which work is supposed to be based off this idea that value is external. And so I think that what the mind does when it is working towards this idea, and I think it's sort of hard to maybe grasp because it is, like trying to say what we don't know, almost. Which, if I was to sort of say what the ultimate representation of that is, it would be death. That is the one thing that almost everybody says is true that we honestly can tell nothing from. And so, sort of just building off of that and this motion that I have now, I think perhaps philosophy or any movement at all is what I'm going to just generalize even philosophy into, so that it's almost like any of these interpretations of the world can come about from there being almost, any way of creating lineation or division among experiences. And so I think that any movement or motion basically works to prove and I feel like I'm onto sort of a great way of paralleling all of this conversation here, not using any words or anything of the like from these individuals, so it can sort of be something contemporary and not necessarily a copy, but obviously with consideration to and of these things. I think that every motion works to prove stillness. Okay? Is the basic idea. And the greater the motion, perhaps, is where we'll get to the idea again of something approaching the speed of light, is where its mass becomes infinite. And how I'm going to sort of relate this into words, and then I'll retell it again from a human narrative rather than sort of a mathematical one. But the idea that as any motion basically serves to prove the idea of motion more, basically then it describes everything. And the only thing that can describe everything is something that is everything. Which would then mean that its motion has ceased to be. So that is how you look at it from a mathematical way, is what I would say, right? Now, looking at it from the human narrative, perhaps the more that we rely on feeling, the more that we basically express that idea of feeling or emotion, is what I'm categorizing as a sensory factor of life. The more that we're able to actually express that idea, I think then we are working to prove that there are things that have no emotions. And I think that how that works is that anything with emotion itself is inherently only there because of structure. And then perhaps we can see a reflection of maybe how our environment actually sort of interplays with character itself, maybe with some whole argument now about nature versus nurture that could go on. But if there is any sort of physical structure that would completely define all emotion, then perhaps it would be like we were pinned in this physical structure, and then in a sense could basically go nowhere. In that sense, like we've literally experienced a physical nature of something, a physical expression, by which its angles, as we then experience the object itself, would basically create an idea of something with no feeling, which obviously would be death. Something with no consciousness, no feeling or anything. And perhaps the reasoning behind that is because it tells us that it knows everything. It tells us that it knows everything that will happen by its physical nature, its physical structure. It knows everything that will ever happen. And then perhaps we've sort of bridged the heart into the mind there a little bit. Which then would create a sensation devoid of life, because we would have no ability to experience anything. And so I think that ultimately, though, that whole idea does exist in our world, and I think it's just more simply stated as a point. I think when something says that we get the point, we obviously know that this is the way we must go if something does get the point. And then so perhaps the way that life works, sort of based off of those two ideas, and I could say other things. I know I've read a lot of books with a lot of different theories on all this stuff, you know what I mean? What does the Bible say? Nobody can see the face of God. Maybe it's just something to the extent of that, you know what I mean? Like nobody can experience everything. You know what I mean? Maybe I could just say it in a different way, right? It's all a matter of the motion and the movement, I guess, that is your initial basis off of who you believe you are, and maybe more so what you want. So in that sense, I think that I can sort of reiterate some things that I said the other day, where I talked about all philosophy is doing is working to create a blank. And perhaps then in our own lives, all we see that is as potential. We see points themselves as potential, and we see things that aren't points as the potential to be points. Which I think that in the nature of the word itself, it creates experience, because a point is ironically singular. Okay? And so since the point is singular, it basically allows there to be division. As soon as we understand that we have a point. Or if we see something by which we could create a great point with, which I think basically then reiterates my idea of fear. Which perhaps fear could be a point. Depending on which direction it points in. But I think the ultimate fear of everything is that perhaps again, ironically, that they get the point. I kind of want to work towards dissolving this conversation so that I can reach what I feel like to be a greater sense of absolution. But I think that I have narrated enough for it to be something that I can rest with. So a point itself creates experience by it actually being singular, which denotes division. And so the point of all things is to divide. So then maybe this point is again like a circle, or again something that's completely open, so that way I can see the dual nature of everything, and perhaps even the triple nature of everything. As I create this idea that it has a point. There's a point, there's a circle, there is a square. And again, perhaps maybe the point is to be open. Which again, if we render the idea into something that is square or circle, then we say that if it is a circle, then it is open. And the greater the point, the greater the diameter of the circle, ultimately until the circle seems to be linear in its expression of being observed at a point upon which we could say that the line is pretty square. And then so there's your triple point. And with that triple point, I think we could probably even translate our conversation into some sort of Pythagorean principality here, where ultimately I think Pythagoras, to me, renders into the idea of reaching for a thing more than anything. It's by knowing a trajectory, but the more confident we are in the angle to begin with, then I think that the more that we believe that we will connect with the other side. And so I think that it purely rests upon your ability to exact a degree to begin with, to basically create this idea of a triplicate or a triangle of any means, which again I think has as much there to be known about. In there is great tests of these other directions by having to understand the degree and angle to such an exactitude for you to be able to carry with confidence to the point in which you then basically are confident in drawing another line. Perhaps, which is what all maybe a triangle is the act of drawing an initial line. And then we can kind of work vice versa to predict an angle. And I think that maybe what that does more than anything is allows us to see choice and perhaps divisions with a narrative and a setting that allows us to see choices in a much sort of less focused, but focused enough way that we can then make predictions with enough confidence to predict narratives and have a sense that we have decision-making power in this experience of life, which is perhaps a great philosophical moment for me in being able to narrate that to you at this time, because then it actually does allow for there to be conversation between choices and fate and all this other stuff. If we then say the point is a triangle, because ultimately, what is a point if we aren't able to zoom in on it enough? It could be anything, especially the more fine the point is, which I think Pythagoras might argue for, because obviously the guy was obsessed with triangles. But that's my expression, triangularly, I would say. We've done circularly and sort of squarely. And I think ultimately then I can get to a finer point, which is to say that this point of all things is a very fine point. And I think that's very key to say that it's a fine point. Which I think that this allows there to be feeling that coexists with the absence of feeling at a point. Which then works off of our ability to say that we have experienced as an observation, so that then we can basically use that to confidently consider an angle, and the angle of first cause is observation. And I feel like there would be no way of knowing if we exist momentarily, if that fine point of first cause exists with emotional observation. But anyways, he goes on to further finesse all of his works, and he's basically becoming a teacher, and now he has excelling students, which seems to show that he has created enough of a division of things that people are able to see and triangulate positions of things, which is intelligence, I think, itself. Perhaps the ability to triangulate itself in itself. And even they play off of a word here, which I think, whether it comes consciously or unconsciously, did it come naturally, or was this sort of like forced, and if it was forced, under what conditions, I think is important. But they end up calling one of the students a geek after we're sitting here studying Greek. I think it is kind of important to make that mention, even though it seems pretty finicky. I think that the ability to sort of play off those notions sort of shows that you can do this type of conversation and maybe live a certain type of life with surroundings that emphasize these points, perhaps. But to what detail do you actually sort of make that play with recognizing things? So I do think that it is important to notice that. That would be almost be the first thing that I would mark in this. If I had something good to mark with, I would probably mark that point right there. See if I can show you guys. What a geek. And I do think that it is important to notice whether or not you do that consciously or unconsciously, because the more you do that consciously, the more that you can actually make a point out of it. But the irony being that it's almost more appreciated unconsciously. So if you're doing it either way, I think it obviously is a display of character of how you do it, because even somebody who's doing it without considering basically trying to translate something to another perspective is still going to denote the value of somebody's character, even if they're doing it consciously or unconsciously. So there's still a value of character there by doing that. So then maybe perhaps the point of all things is to be emotionally observant. Okay, which is like a considerate stance on things. And perhaps maybe that is the greatest start of all things, is just a considerate stance on things. Maybe it's the most stable way we can express the beginning of all things. I know everybody wants to say that everything begins with everything. But I think emotion, and in saying that emotion begins there with consideration, again, it's just like that triangulation, like with how much detail do you want to predict the initial angle of things, which depicts two things, which then creates a line, which then divides things. But I think it's important to try not to say everything is nothing or everything is everything, and then we can actually sort of confidently state a middle ground, so to speak. I think this is sort of nuanced and almost originally imagined here with me, whatever I'm viewing to be. But that idea that there is that emotion in the beginning, I think, the smartest way to say that is to say that with emotion there in the beginning, it gives us time. And I know that other fascinations on this topic will then say that it's either all time or no time again on those ends. But it gives us time. And so in the beginning, there is time, consideration, and emotion. As perhaps the beginning of all things. And now that we've sort of furthered those other two, maybe we can talk on time a little bit to give us a greater sense of this expression where time is probably more appropriately memory, even. Which then maybe gives people an allotment of the initial point of all things, knowing something. Which then we have head, heart, what did I say? Emotion, consideration, and time. Head, heart, and hand. I mean, what are feet, but just almost an extra pair of hands if I am given enough consideration for it. But head, heart, and hand. The hand considers many things. If I was to parallel it into a thing, it is a very divisive trap to try to say how. But perhaps maybe I could say it best by saying that there are fine points all over. And if they are truly all fine points, considering the conversation that we have had, then every point would be a fine point. And if we were to really consider why we want to know things, we want to know the state that they are in. Is all the reason we have for knowledge, perhaps. And then maybe that can quench emotion enough for us to perhaps say that what? A truly fine point would be that if we do affect anything by any matter, that at that point in which we are considered, there exists a triplicate of your soul of a temporal sphere and a solid sphere, where then your soul is a sphere. The solid sphere is where all spheres go. And the temporal sphere is where all spheres go to go. And your soul is composed of time, consideration, and emotion. Then I think we can see all these three things as the same thing. And then maybe in that imagery, it creates a perfect state which perhaps satisfies question which is all that it really needs to do. because you can see it. And as you can see it, it's touched you. And then perhaps there is proof that there is truth. That perhaps there is always a good angle which then gives me the sensation that is our idea of truth something that ends, or with something that begins. Is truth final and absolute? Which then ironically I feel like is a bad angle. Which is a point, not a fine point, perhaps. And perhaps now maybe I've described two sides of things, which is perhaps emotion itself, contained within the one emotion, if I was to further the idea of emotion, which I defined as movement originally. And then perhaps maybe that I've proved that there's always two things, then ergo I have proved truth. Which is the defining basis of truth, that there is two. Even though one always wants there to be one. Which is division, which I think allows there to be one at the same time. So I think you can trick it so that it becomes that triplicate and doesn't interfere with anything. But I think that's ultimately how you can do that. So then if we rest off the idea that emotion has these two agents to it, and one is the end and one is the beginning, then perhaps for a moment we can be the third agent. And perhaps if we add in another detail here, we can actually create the idea of which one has more truth if we say which one has more character, perhaps, if character is another form of expression. Then what did I say about character before? I spoke of something that's a perfect character, and I described it in detail. That was with Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, in my last series. But without sort of getting into that too much, I think that the moment that we recognize the angle with a good character, which I still think leaves there to be plenty of room for what exactly that entails. Maybe we introduce the idea of a good character to the beginning of the process as well. I think that can give us something here. And again, we'll see if I'm skilled or not, basically, in my ability to do all of this within time. That perhaps the thing that is the bad angle that doesn't consider character doesn't almost consider truth, because again, truth is only proven by there being two things. Which then perhaps we can ascribe a good character to the first beginning. Okay, see? And I think I've done it. And now I'm like completely blank, almost. I think it would be kind of interesting to end on a blank rather than ending on a point. So I think I'm going to do that.